On the morning of the 16th of September 1992, the British government believed it was in control of the pound. By the time the sun set that evening, it had spent billions of pounds it did not have, raised interest rates twice in a single day, in a state of open panic, and surrendered to a group of people who did not hold a single seat in Parliament, command a single soldier, or answer to a single voter. They were traders, and in the space of one working day, they did something no invading army had managed in modern history. They forced the British state into full retreat, took its money, and walked away richer than some countries. This is the story of Black Wednesday, the day the markets went to war with the Bank of England and won. It is a story about pride, about a trap that Britain walked into with its eyes open, and about the single most profitable trade in the history of finance. But underneath all of that, it is a story about a very simple idea that governments keep forgetting and keep paying for. You cannot fix the price of money by decree. Sooner or later, the market will find out what that money is really worth. And when it does, it will send you the bill. This was not the first time Britain had gone to war over the value of its own money. A generation earlier, in 1967, a Labour government under Harold Wilson had fought for months to stop the pound from being devalued, insisting again and again that the line would hold. It did not hold. When the pound was finally cut, Wilson went on television and told the nation that the pound in their pocket had not lost its value. It was a sentence so at odds with what people could see in the shops that it became a national byword for political denial. The deeper truth of 1967 was written in plain sight for anyone willing to read it. A government can repeat a promise about its currency as often as it likes. The market keeps its own accounts, and in the end, it always collects. 25 years later, a new generation of politicians had either forgotten that lesson or persuaded themselves that this time would be different. It would not be different. It would only be larger, faster, and far more expensive. To understand how a nation lost a war in a day, you first have to understand the battlefield, and the battlefield was something called the exchange rate mechanism. In the years after the Second World War, the countries of Western Europe had watched their currencies swing wildly against one another. A strong franc one year, a weak franc the next, a lira that seemed to lose value by the month. For businesses trying to trade across borders, this was a nightmare. If you were a German company selling machines to Italy, you could sign a contract at one price and lose your entire profit before the payment arrived, simply because the exchange rate had moved against you. So Europe reached for an old dream, the dream of stable money. Currencies that held still against one another, so that trade could flow without fear. The exchange rate mechanism, launched in 1979, was the machinery built to make that dream real. The idea was elegant on paper. Each member country agreed to hold its currency within a narrow band against the others. Think of it as a room full of climbers, all roped together. Nobody is allowed to drift too far from the group. If your currency started to rise too high or fall too low, your central bank was obligated to step in, buying or selling to drag it back into line. And at the center of the room, holding the strongest rope, stood the German mark. The mark was the anchor. Germany had the largest economy in Europe, the most disciplined central bank, and a national memory of hyperinflation so deep that keeping money stable was almost a religion. Everyone else, in effect, agreed to follow the mark. For years, Britain stayed out. Margaret Thatcher was deeply suspicious of the whole arrangement. She understood something that many of her own ministers did not want to hear. To join the mechanism was to hand control of British interest rates to a committee in Frankfurt. It was to give up one of the most powerful levers a government has over its own economy. She resisted it for as long as she could. But the pressure inside her own party was relentless. Her Chancellor and her Foreign Secretary wanted in. British business wanted the stability. And the promise was seductive. Join the mechanism, tie the pound to the mighty German mark, and Britain would import Germany's famous low inflation as if by magic. The discipline of the mark would do what British politicians had never managed to do on their own. It would tame the pound. In October 1990, Britain finally joined, and here we arrive at the first fatal decision, the one that would set the trap. When you join a system of fixed exchange rates, the single most important question is the price. At what rate do you lock in? Britain locked the pound in at 2.95 German marks. And that number was too high, dangerously, catastrophically too high. A strong pound sounds like a good thing. National pride likes a strong currency. But a currency that is priced above its true worth is a slow poison for an economy. It makes your exports expensive, so the rest of the world buys less of what you make. It makes foreign goods cheap, so your own citizens stop buying from local producers. Factory by factory, order by order, an overvalued currency quietly strangles the industries that depend on selling abroad. Britain had chained itself to the mark at a rate its economy simply could not sustain. But for a while, nothing happened. The trap was set, but the jaws had not yet closed. And what closed them was an event that had nothing to do with Britain at all. It happened in Berlin. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Within a year, East and West Germany were reunited. It was one of the great triumphant moments of the century. But reunification came with a colossal bill. West Germany had to rebuild the shattered, bankrupt economy of the East, pouring in staggering sums of money to bring millions of new citizens up to Western standards of living almost overnight. All of that spending poured money into the German economy, and that flood of money threatened to raise prices. It threatened inflation. And to the German central bank, the Bundesbank, inflation was the one enemy that could never be allowed to win. So the Bundesbank did the textbook thing. To cool an overheating economy, it raised interest rates. It raised them hard, and it kept them high. Now remember the climbers, all roped together. Germany was the anchor. When Germany raised its interest rates, every other country tied to the mark faced an agonizing choice. Because money is like water, it flows toward the highest return. With German rates climbing, investors around the world wanted to hold marks where they could earn more. To stop their own currencies from sinking against the rising mark, the other members had to raise their own interest rates to match, whether their economies could bear it or not. And Britain's economy could not bear it. This is the heart of the tragedy. In 1992, Germany needed high interest rates to cool an economy running hot. But Britain was in the opposite situation. Britain was sliding into recession. Businesses were failing. Unemployment was rising. Homeowners were trapped in a housing crash, watching the value of their homes fall below the size of their mortgages. An economy in that condition is crying out for lower interest rates. to ease the burden on borrowers and breathe life back into spending. Britain needed to cut rates. But the exchange rate mechanism demanded that Britain keep them high to defend the pound's link to the mark. The government was being asked to press the accelerator and the brake at the same time, and every driver knows how that ends. The markets could see it too, and this is where the traders enter the story. Because a fixed exchange rate that everyone knows is unsustainable is not a wall, it is an invitation. To see why, put yourself in the position of a speculator looking at the pound in the summer of 1992. You are being offered a bet that is almost unfair in your favour. On one side, the British government insists it will hold the pound at its fixed rate. If it succeeds, the pound barely moves, and you lose very little, because a currency inside the mechanism can only travel within a narrow band. On the other side, if the government fails and the pound is forced out, it will fall sharply, and you will make a fortune. A small loss if you are wrong. An enormous gain if you are right. A bet shaped like that is barely a gamble at all, and the more traders who noticed it, the more irresistible it became. This is the hidden flaw at the heart of every defended fixed exchange rate. The moment the market begins to doubt it, the doubt starts to feed on itself, because everyone can see that the cost of betting against the currency is small and the possible reward is vast. The British government was no longer facing a handful of opportunists. It was facing the combined logic of the entire financial world, arriving at the same conclusion at the same hour. The people who accepted that invitation most aggressively worked for a man named George Soros. Soros ran a fund called the Quantum Fund, and he had built his career on a single ruthless insight. Markets are not always rational. They are driven by human belief. And human belief can become detached from reality for a long time. But not forever. And the moment when belief snaps back to reality is the moment when fortunes are made. Soros and his lead strategist, a trader named Stanley Druckenmiller, looked at Britain in the summer of 1992, and they saw something close to a certainty. They saw a government defending a price for the pound that the British economy could not justify. They saw a currency held up by nothing but political willpower and promises. And they understood that political willpower, unlike gravity, can break. So they prepared to make a bet. But to understand the bet, you have to understand the weapon they used. The weapon was called short selling, and it is one of the most misunderstood ideas in finance. So let us be clear about exactly how it works, because everything that follows depends on it. Normally, you make money by buying something, watching it rise in value, and selling it for more than you paid. Short selling is the mirror image. It is a way to make money when something falls. Here is the mechanism. You borrow an asset that you believe is about to lose value, in this case, pounds. You immediately sell those borrowed pounds and convert them into a currency you trust, in this case, German marks. Then you wait. If you are right and the pound collapses, you can buy back the same number of pounds later for far fewer marks than you sold them for. You return the pounds you borrowed and you keep the difference. The bigger the fall, the bigger the profit. Now consider the scale. Soros did not borrow a few pounds. Through his fund, he built a position worth billions. He was, in effect, borrowing the British pound by the mountain and selling it into the market, betting the entire structure would come crashing down. There is a detail in how that bet was placed that has been retold on trading floors ever since. According to accounts from inside the fund, it was Druckenmiller who first concluded that the decisive moment had arrived and who proposed putting a large sum on the pound falling. Soros listened and then asked a question that has become famous in the world of finance. "If you are as certain as you say," he asked, "then why are you betting so little?" This was not, in his view, an occasion for a careful, measured position. It was one of those rare moments when the odds were so lopsided that the only real mistake would be timidity. He told Druckenmiller to go for the jugular. So they did. They did not merely lean against the pound, they threw the full weight of the fund behind the trade, borrowing and selling sterling on a scale that would have looked reckless to anyone who did not share their conviction. If they were wrong, the losses would have been brutal, but they had read the situation far more clearly than the government whose currency they were selling. And Soros was not alone. As the summer wore on, more and more traders around the world reached the same conclusion and placed the same bet. A one-way tide began to build against the pound. The trap was closing, and Britain could feel it. Throughout the summer of 1992, the pressure on the pound grew and grew. The Bank of England was forced to keep buying pounds, spending its foreign currency reserves to prop up the price and keep it inside the mechanism's band. Government ministers gave speech after speech insisting that the pound was strong, that devaluation was unthinkable, that Britain would never break its commitment. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont, staked his reputation on it. The message was constant and absolute. The line will hold. But the markets have a cruel way of testing absolute promises. And in early September, they found a crack. It was not in Britain, it was in Italy. The Italian lira was another currency chained to the mark at a rate it could not sustain, and it broke first. The lira came under such ferocious pressure that Italy was forced to devalue. For the speculators, this was the smell of blood in the water. If one country could be forced out of the mechanism, the invincible system was not invincible after all. It was a row of dominoes. And every trader now turned to look at the biggest, weakest domino still standing, the British pound. The final act began with a single sentence. Just before the crisis broke, the president of the Bundesbank gave an interview. In it, he suggested, in careful central banker's language, that some currencies in the mechanism might still need to be realigned. He did not name the pound. He did not have to. To the markets, it read as an admission from the most powerful central bank in Europe that the defense of sterling might be hopeless. Germany, it seemed, was not going to ride to Britain's rescue. That was the signal. Overnight, the trickle of selling became a flood. By the morning of the 16th of September, the assault on the pound was total. What followed inside the British Treasury and the Bank of England that day was, by every account, a scene of mounting panic dressed in the calm language of officialdom. The pound was being hammered down toward the bottom of its permitted band. Below that floor, Britain would be in breach of its treaty obligations. So the Bank of England did the only thing it was designed to do. It began to buy pounds. Enormous quantities of pounds. It reached into the nation's foreign currency reserves and spent them by the billion, trying to soak up the tidal wave of selling and hold the price up by brute force. It was like trying to hold back the sea with a bucket. For every pound the bank bought, the speculators sold more. The reserves drained away hour by hour. By some estimates, the bank was spending around £2 billion an hour at the peak, and it was making no difference at all. The selling was simply too vast. Inside the Treasury, ministers and officials moved between crisis meetings with a growing sense of unreality. Among the advisors in the building that day were figures who would go on to shape British politics for the next 30 years, watching at close range as the full machinery of the state was overwhelmed by the market. Urgent messages were sent to Germany, asking the Bundesbank to cut its own interest rates even slightly, a gesture that might have taken some of the pressure off the pound. The answer that came back amounted to no. Germany had its own inflation to fight, and it would not weaken that fight to rescue a neighbour's currency. Britain was alone. And each time the Bank of England released another wave of reserves into the market, the price of the pound barely twitched. Billions were absorbed as though they were pocket change. It was the financial equivalent of firing shell after shell into thick fog and hearing nothing at all come back. So the government reached for its second weapon, the interest rate. Remember, high interest rates are supposed to make a currency more attractive to hold. If you raise the reward for holding pounds, in theory, people will want to buy them. That morning, the government raised interest rates from 10% to 12%. A huge increase, announced in the middle of a working day, an emergency measure meant to shock the markets into believing Britain would defend the pound at any cost. And the markets did not blink. The pound did not recover. The selling did not stop. The traders had done their arithmetic, and they had reached a conclusion that turned out to be devastatingly correct. They did not believe the British government would actually keep interest rates that high, because doing so would destroy an economy already in recession. The rate rise was a bluff, and everyone at the table could see the cards. So a few hours later, the government did something almost without precedent. It announced a second rate rise on the same day. Interest rates would go to 15%. In the space of a single afternoon, the cost of borrowing in Britain had been driven up by half, from 10 to 15%, a level that would have crushed businesses and homeowners across the entire country if it had lasted. It is worth pausing on what that would have meant in ordinary lives. Millions of British families held mortgages whose monthly payments rose and fell directly with interest rates. To push those rates to 15% and to hold them there would have meant a wave of missed payments, repossessions, and broken households, on top of a recession that was already biting hard. The government knew this. The markets knew that the government knew it, and that shared knowledge was precisely why the bluff failed. A threat is only ever as strong as the willingness to carry it out, and everyone in the market could see that Britain could not possibly live with 15% interest rates for any length of time. The weapon the government kept reaching for was one it could never actually afford to fire. And still, the pound did not move. The markets looked at a government raising rates toward levels that would cause an economic catastrophe, and they simply did not believe it could hold. The second rise was not a show of strength. It was the flailing of a state that had run out of options. Everyone watching understood the truth. This was not the sound of a line holding. It was the sound of a line breaking. By the evening, it was over. Inside the Treasury, the recognition finally set in that the battle was lost, that no amount of money and no level of interest rate was going to turn back a market this large and this certain. And so, that night, the Chancellor Norman Lamont walked out to face the cameras and admitted defeat. He announced that Britain was suspending its membership of the exchange rate mechanism. The pound was cut loose. The second rate rise to 15% was cancelled before it ever took effect. The great experiment was finished. Britain had been driven out of the system it had joined with such confidence just 2 years before. The mechanism had promised stability and discipline. What it delivered was the most humiliating financial defeat in modern British history. Now came the reckoning, and the numbers are worth stating plainly because they are staggering. The Treasury later estimated that the failed defence of the pound had cost the British taxpayer around £3.3 billion. That was the money burned in a single day, trying to hold up a price the market had already condemned. Some of that loss came from the reserves spent buying pounds that were instantly worth less. It was, in effect, a fortune set on fire in the space of an afternoon. And on the other side of the trade stood George Soros. When the pound was finally cut loose, it fell sharply, exactly as he had predicted. He closed his position, buying back the cheap pounds he had sold high, and the profit was reported to be around $1 billion. $1 billion from one bet in a matter of days. It made him a legend. The newspapers gave him a title that would follow him for the rest of his life. The man who broke the Bank of England. But here is where the story turns, and where it becomes something more interesting than a simple tale of national humiliation. Because in the strangest twist of all, Black Wednesday may have been the best thing to happen to the British economy in a generation. Think about what actually happened the day after. Freed from the mechanism, Britain no longer had to defend an impossible exchange rate. The pound was allowed to fall to a level the market considered fair, which made British exports competitive again. And crucially, the government was finally free to do what its own economy had been begging for. It could cut interest rates. And it did, again and again, easing the burden on millions of homeowners and businesses. The result was remarkable. The recession lifted. Exports grew. Inflation stayed low. Britain entered one of the longest continuous stretches of economic growth in its modern history. Some economists took to calling it not Black Wednesday, but White Wednesday, because the humiliation had quietly set the stage for a recovery. The defeat had freed Britain from a cage it should never have entered. The figures of that recovery tell the story more honestly than any speech could. In the years that followed, unemployment, which had been climbing without relief, began to fall. Inflation, the very enemy the whole painful exercise had been designed to defeat, stayed low regardless, without any need for the cage of the mechanism to hold it down. The economy grew, quarter after quarter, in an expansion that would run for well over a decade. Almost everything the exchange rate mechanism had promised to deliver, Britain finally achieved only after being thrown out of it. As for Norman Lamont, the Chancellor who had staked his reputation on defending the pound to the very last, the day effectively ended his time at the Treasury, and he was moved out of the post within the year. He later remarked, with the dark humour of a man who had lived through it, that he had been heard singing in his bath the morning after the pound was set free, relieved beyond words that the impossible defence was finally over. Whether or not the story was ever quite true, it captured something real about that strange moment. To those who understood what had actually happened, the defeat felt less like a catastrophe than like the breaking of a long and dangerous fever. But if the economy recovered, the political damage never did. And this is the deepest and most lasting consequence of that single day. The governing Conservative Party had built its entire reputation on one promise above all others, that it, and only it, could be trusted to manage the economy. On the 16th of September, in front of the whole country, that reputation was destroyed in an afternoon. The public had watched the government spend billions of their money defending an indefensible position, raise interest rates twice in a panic, and then surrender anyway. The image of competence shattered, and it did not come back. It would be years before that party won a general election again, and many historians trace the beginning of its long fall directly to that day. There was one more consequence, quieter, but perhaps the most important of all. The trauma of Black Wednesday burned itself so deeply into the British political memory that it shaped the country's relationship with Europe for decades. When the time came, years later, to consider whether Britain should give up the pound entirely and adopt the single European currency, the euro, the memory of that day hung over the entire debate. Britain had tried once to lock its currency to the continents. It had ended in disaster. That memory was one of the reasons Britain kept the pound and kept it to this day. So, what are we to make of it all? A government that walked knowingly into a trap, a currency defended to the point of ruin. A single trader who read the situation more clearly than an entire nation's treasury and was rewarded with $1 billion. And a defeat that turned, against all expectation, into a recovery. The lesson of Black Wednesday is the oldest lesson in finance, and it is one that the powerful relearn in every generation. A price that is set by politics rather than reality is a promise waiting to be broken. You can defend it with speeches. You can defend it with reserves. You can defend it with interest rates high enough to frighten a nation. But you cannot defend it forever, because on the other side of that promise stands the entire weight of the global market, patient and unsentimental, waiting to find out what your money is truly worth. Britain found out on a Wednesday in September. The bill came to £3.3 billion, and the man who sent it walked away a billionaire. Sources for this account include the official records and later testimony surrounding the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the exchange rate mechanism, contemporary reporting by the BBC, the Financial Times, and the Times of London, the published estimates of the Treasury on the cost of the intervention, and the widely reported accounts of the Quantum Fund's position given by George Soros and Stanley Druckenmiller in the years that followed. In the year 1720, the entire city of London seemed to lose its mind at once. Servants and dukes, poets and politicians, clergymen and shopkeepers, soldiers and widows, all of them crowded into the narrow streets and coffee houses around the exchange, clutching handfuls of money, jostling and shouting, desperate to buy shares in a single company. A fever had gripped the capital, a fever for easy riches, and it burned hotter with every passing week. And within a matter of months, a great many of those same people would be utterly ruined, their fortunes gone, their names disgraced, some of them driven to despair and worse. This is the story of the South Sea Bubble, the first great financial mania of the modern age, and the template, the original pattern, for very nearly every bubble and crash that has followed it in the 3 centuries since. It is a story of greed and delusion, of clever men and foolish schemes, of a whole society persuading itself to believe in something that was not there. And at its very center stands one of the most brilliant minds in all of human history, Sir Isaac Newton himself, who understood the laws that govern the stars and the planets, and yet was ruined all the same. Because the South Sea bubble teaches a lesson that intelligence alone can never protect you from, and it is a lesson the world seems doomed to relearn at terrible cost in every single generation. To understand the madness, you must first understand the scheme at the heart of it, because the South Sea bubble was not born from nothing. It grew out of a very real and very serious problem. The British government, after years of costly wars, was staggering under an enormous burden of national debt. It owed vast sums to a great many people, and the weight of that debt hung over the nation's finances like a storm cloud. The government was desperate for a clever solution, some financial magic that might make the problem more manageable. And into that desperation stepped a company with a bold and beguiling proposal. The company was called the South Sea Company. On paper, its purpose was trade. It had been granted a monopoly, an exclusive right to conduct British trade with the ports of South America and the surrounding seas. To the public, this sounded like a license to print money. South America, in the imagination of the age, was a land of unimaginable wealth, of mountains of silver and rivers of gold, of endless riches, simply waiting to be carried home in the holds of British ships. Surely a company with the exclusive right to trade with such a place would grow fabulously rich, and everyone who owned a piece of it would grow rich alongside it. But here is the first and most important truth of the entire affair: that trade barely existed. Spain, which actually controlled most of South America, permitted the British only the smallest and most restricted access, a mere trickle of commerce that earned the company almost nothing of real value. The glittering vision of South American riches was, in cold reality, very nearly empty. The South Sea Company's true business was never really about trade at all. Its true business was something far cleverer and far more dangerous. It was about that national debt. The scheme, stripped of its complexity, worked like this. The South Sea Company proposed to take over a huge portion of the government's debt. The people to whom the government owed money would exchange what they were owed for shares in the company instead. In return for taking this weight off the government's shoulders, the company was granted the right to issue those shares. And the whole grand structure depended utterly and completely on one single thing: the price of the company's shares. If that price could be driven higher and higher, everyone involved stood to profit enormously. The directors, the government, the early investors, all of them. And so the men who ran the South Sea Company set out, quite deliberately, to drive that price to the heavens. What followed was a masterclass in the art of inflating a bubble, and the methods they used are precisely the same methods used in every mania since. The directors of the company set about spreading rumors, glowing and irresistible rumors, of the fabulous wealth pouring in from the South Seas. Tales of treasure, of profitable voyages, of riches beyond counting were whispered in the coffee houses and printed in the papers. Confidence swelled, and as the story spread, people began, cautiously at first, and then in a flood, to buy the shares. And now the machine truly began to turn, because a bubble is a machine, an engine designed to inflate itself. As more people bought the shares, the price of those shares rose, and as the price rose, something dangerous happened in the minds of everyone watching. The rising price itself seemed to be the proof. "Look," they said, "the price is climbing, which means the rumors must be true, which means I should buy before it climbs higher still." And so the rising price drew in more buyers, and the new buyers pushed the price higher, which drew in still more buyers. Each rise appeared to justify the next. The evidence for the investment was simply the fact that its price was going up, a piece of circular logic that has bankrupted more people across history than almost any other single idea. The company poured fuel onto the fire in every way it could. Most dangerously of all, it began to lend people money to buy its own shares. Think about what that means. If you did not have the cash to join the frenzy, the company itself would lend it to you, so that you could buy its shares, which pushed the price up, which made everyone feel richer, which encouraged still more borrowing and buying. It was a perfect, self-reinforcing spiral, and for a while it seemed almost miraculous. Everyone was getting rich, and no one stopped to ask the simple, deadly question: rich from what? From what actual trade? What actual product? What actual profit? The answer, had anyone dared to look, was almost nothing at all. But nobody wanted to look. Looking was for cowards, for cynics, for those too timid to seize the fortune of a lifetime. The numbers of the mania are genuinely staggering even now. At the start of the year 1720, a single share in the South Sea Company traded at around £128. As the fever took hold through the spring and into the summer, the price began to climb with astonishing speed. £200, £300, £500. And then, at the very height of the madness, a single share reached a price of over £1,000. In the space of a few short months, the value of the shares had multiplied nearly eightfold. And let us be perfectly clear about why. Not because the company had discovered a single new source of wealth, not because it had sold anything, or traded anything, or earned anything of substance. The price had risen eightfold purely and entirely because everyone believed it would keep rising. It was belief, and nothing but belief, holding up a mountain of money. The mania did not stay confined to the South Sea Company alone. That is another mark of a true bubble, the way the madness spreads outward and infects everything around it. As Londoners watched ordinary people transformed into paper fortunes overnight, a wild enthusiasm for buying shares in almost anything took hold. And so, seeing the appetite of the crowd, promoters and swindlers rushed to launch dozens of brand new companies, each hoping to catch the same golden fever. These came to be known as the bubble companies, and some of them were so absurd that they would be comical if the consequences had not been so tragic. There were companies formed to import walnut trees, to make a wheel of perpetual motion, to ensure and improve children's fortunes, to trade in human hair. And then there is the one that has echoed down the centuries as the perfect symbol of the whole insane episode. A company, so the famous account goes, was floated for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. A business, in other words, whose actual purpose the founder refused to reveal. And still, intoxicated by the certainty that any share would rise, that the only mistake was to hesitate, investors are said to have handed over their money for a stake in a mystery, in nothing at all. Whether every detail of that particular tale is literally true almost does not matter, because it captures something that was profoundly and dangerously real. a crowd so consumed by greed and by the fear of missing out that it had entirely stopped caring what it was actually buying. The physical heart of this frenzy was a narrow lane in the City of London called Exchange Alley, a cramped tangle of coffee houses and dealing rooms where the shares changed hands. And in the summer of 1720, it became the most feverish place in the entire kingdom. From dawn until long after dark, the alley was choked with a heaving, shouting mass of humanity, all pressed together in the pursuit of paper riches. Fine ladies arrived in their carriages and sat waiting while their agents fought through the crush to buy on their behalf. Aristocrats rubbed shoulders with tradesmen, clergymen with card sharps, all of them united by the single overpowering hope of getting rich before the miracle ended. Servants who had bought a few shares found themselves on paper wealthier than their masters. Fortunes were made and lost between breakfast and supper. It was said that a man could buy a share in the morning and sell it in the afternoon for double what he had paid, and for a giddy few months this was very nearly true. The whole ordinary business of the country seemed to pause, as if the nation had collectively decided that the tedious work of farming and manufacturing and trading was for fools, when a fortune could be conjured out of thin air in a coffee house in Exchange Alley. It was the atmosphere of a great carnival or a vast gambling hall, and almost nobody paused to consider that carnivals end, and that the house, in the end, always wins. And it is here, into this whirlwind of delusion, that our most famous character enters the story. For among the great crowd of investors caught up in the South Sea fever was none other than Sir Isaac Newton, the president of the Royal Society, the man who had unlocked the mathematics of gravity, who had explained the motion of the moon and the planets and the tides, whose mind was perhaps the most powerful the world had yet produced. And even he, this titan of human reason, was not immune. Newton, in fact, had played the game rather well at first. He had bought South Sea shares early when the price was still climbing, and at a certain point, showing admirable good sense, he sold them, walking away with a very handsome profit of thousands of pounds. He had, it seemed, been wise. He had taken his gains and stepped back from the table while the game was still on. Had the story ended there, Newton would be remembered as one of the few who kept his head. But the story did not end there, and this is the part that makes it immortal. Because Newton then had to watch from the sidelines as the price of the shares he had sold climbed higher and higher and higher still. He had to watch as friends and acquaintances, men perhaps not half so clever as he, grew richer and richer on the very shares he had abandoned. And something broke in him, the same something that breaks in all of us, that ancient and unbearable feeling of watching others grow wealthy while you stand aside. It has a name in our own time. We call it the fear of missing out, and it seized Isaac Newton, the greatest rational mind of his age, and it overwhelmed his judgment completely. So he bought back in. Near the top of the market, at a wildly inflated price, he plunged back into the South Sea shares, and this time with a far, far greater sum of his fortune than before. He abandoned the caution that had served him so well, and he joined the herd at the very worst possible moment. And then, of course, the inevitable happened. The bubble burst, and Isaac Newton lost a fortune, a sum that would be enormous even by the standards of today. The man who could measure the heavens had been ruined by the madness of the crowd. and he is said to have remarked in the bitter aftermath that he could calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. It is one of the great sentences in the history of money, precisely because of who spoke it. Because the crash did come, as it always must. A bubble inflated purely by belief requires one thing above all else to keep rising. It requires a constant, endless supply of new buyers, each one willing to pay more than the last. And at some point, that supply must run dry. The most eager buyers have already bought. The pool of people willing to pay these absurd prices begins, at last, to empty. And then the first whispers of doubt appear. A few of the largest and shrewdest holders, sensing that the peak has passed, quietly begin to sell, to lock in their gains while there are still fools to buy from. The price wavers, it stumbles, and the very same machine that had driven the price up now throws itself violently into reverse. For just as every rise had justified the next rise on the way up, now every fall justified the next fall on the way down. As the price dropped, holders panicked, and their panic made them sell, and their selling drove the price lower, which triggered more panic, which drove more selling. The spiral that had lifted the shares to the heavens now dragged them down towards the earth with terrifying speed. Through the autumn of 1720, the South Sea share price collapsed. The shares that had touched £1,000 tumbled back down toward 100 and below, wiping out almost everything the mania had created. Fortunes that had been built over a single glorious summer evaporated in a matter of weeks. And the human wreckage was appalling, because so many had borrowed to buy at the top, lured by the company's own eager lending. A great many people were left not merely poorer, but ruined, owing enormous sums on shares that were now worth a fraction of what they had paid. The ruin cut through every level of society, from the grandest aristocratic households to the humblest tradesmen who had staked their small savings on a dream. Suicides were reported. Families were destroyed. A wave of anguish and fury rolled across the country in the wake of the collapse. To grasp the true human weight of it, you have to remember who these people were. They were not, for the most part, seasoned speculators who understood the risks they ran. They were ordinary men and women who had been swept up in a national euphoria, who had been told by everyone and everything around them that this was a safe and certain path to a better life. There were clergymen who had invested the modest savings of a lifetime of service. There were widows who had staked the small inheritance that stood between them and destitution. There were families who had borrowed against their homes and their futures, certain they were securing prosperity for their children, only to find they had condemned them instead to years of debt and hardship. When the bubble burst, it did not simply erase numbers in a ledger. It shattered lives, dissolved marriages, drove proud men into hiding from their creditors, and filled the country with a bitterness and a sense of betrayal that lingered for a generation. The dream that had felt, only weeks before, like a gift from Providence, now revealed itself for what it had always been, a snare that had caught the trusting and the hopeful most cruelly of all. And perhaps the hardest truth of it was that so many of the ruined had done nothing that the wisest voices of their day had not encouraged. They had simply believed what they were told, and followed the crowd, and trusted that a thing rising so fast and so far must surely be real. The aftermath was as bitter as the mania had been intoxicating. There were furious demands for someone to be punished, and Parliament launched inquiries into the whole affair, and those inquiries uncovered exactly what you might by now expect: corruption on a grand scale. It emerged that the directors of the South Sea Company had bribed politicians and courtiers, handing out shares as gifts to buy their support and their silence. Ministers of the government were found to be deeply implicated. Some of the guilty fled the country to escape justice. Others had their estates seized to compensate, in some small part, the ruined public. A measure of retribution was extracted, but for the great mass of ordinary people who had been ruined, the money, quite simply, was gone, and it never came back. The deeper consequences of the disaster reached far beyond the punishment of a few guilty men. The South Sea bubble left a scar on the whole of British finance so deep that it did not fully heal for the better part of a century. In the immediate aftermath, a shaken and furious Parliament passed a law, remembered as the Bubble Act, which severely restricted the formation of the very kind of joint stock companies that had run wild in 1720. The instinct behind it was understandable, a desperate attempt to make sure such a mania could never happen again, but it also had a cost. For generations afterward, the raising of capital through public companies, one of the great engines of economic growth, was viewed across Britain with a deep and lingering suspicion. The word bubble itself entered the permanent vocabulary of finance, spoken ever after as a warning. A whole nation had been so badly burned that it flinched for lifetimes from the flame. There was a political dimension too, for the corruption uncovered by the inquiries reached into the very highest levels of the state, tainting the government and the court, and it fell to one particular politician to steer the country through the wreckage and restore some measure of confidence and stability. His skillful management of the crisis and its aftermath helped to establish him as the dominant figure in British political life, and he is often remembered as, in effect, the country's first Prime Minister. So even the shape of British government itself was influenced, in its way, by the fallout from the madness of 1720. A financial mania in a handful of London coffee houses had sent ripples outward that touched the law, the markets, and the highest offices of the land for generations to come. And that, perhaps, is the final measure of how large the South Sea bubble truly loomed. It was not merely a story of some investors losing money on a bad bet. It was a moment when an entire society lost its collective mind, when the ordinary rules of caution and common sense were suspended across a whole nation, and when the reckoning that followed was so severe that it reshaped the country's laws, its finances, and even its politics for 100 years. It was, in every sense, the first modern financial catastrophe, and it set the pattern that all the others would follow. So what are we truly to take from this strange and distant episode 300 years on? The answer is that the South Sea bubble matters not because it is strange, but because it is so utterly, so chillingly familiar. Strip away the powdered wigs and the sailing ships and the coffee houses, and it is precisely the same story that has played out again and again in every generation since. A wonderful and mysterious new opportunity, a price that rises for no better reason than that it is already rising. The comforting proof found in every new high that the believers are wise and the doubters are fools. The frantic rush of ordinary people terrified above all of being left behind, borrowing money to fling themselves in near the very top. And then, when the last new buyer has finally been found, the sudden and violent reversal as belief curdles into panic in the space of a few dreadful weeks. And Newton's lament endures for one reason above all. It tells us that the madness of a financial mania is not, at its root, a failure of intelligence. Some of the cleverest people who have ever lived have been ruined by bubbles, and Newton is only the most famous among them. It is not a failure of the mind. It is a failure of temperament, of character, of nerve. It is the near impossible task of remaining calm and rational while everyone around you appears to be growing effortlessly rich, and of holding firmly in your mind the one truth that the crowd has forgotten. That a price which has floated free of any real underlying value is not a fortune waiting patiently to be claimed. It is a trap, primed and set, waiting only for the moment to spring. And if you doubt that the lesson still applies, that we, in our modern and sophisticated age, have somehow grown too clever for such follies, then simply look at the centuries that followed. The same story has repeated itself in new costumes again and again and again. At the very end of the 20th century came the dot-com bubble, when the shares of internet companies, many of which had never earned a single penny of profit and never would, were bid up to insane and dizzying heights, purely on the promise of a glorious digital future, before collapsing and wiping out trillions of dollars of wealth. It was Exchange Alley all over again, only now the coffee houses were computer screens. In 2008 came the great housing and banking crisis, built once more on the comfortable and universal belief that a certain kind of asset, this time houses and the debts attached to them, could only ever rise in value, until it could not, and the whole world economy very nearly came down with it. And in our own time we have watched the wild manias in cryptocurrencies and in all manner of digital tokens, some of which have soared thousands of percent, and then vanished into nothing, driven by exactly the same forces, the rumors, the fear of missing out, the price rising simply because it is rising, the crowd of ordinary people rushing in near the top. The technology changes, the particular dream changes. But the human beings never do. The same greed, the same hope, the same terror of being left behind while others grow rich, the same fatal willingness to believe, all of it is exactly as it was in the coffee houses of London 300 years ago. Isaac Newton's ghost haunts every trading floor and every phone screen to this day, whispering the same warning that so few ever heed. The South Sea Company itself survived, in a diminished and chastened form, for many decades after its great catastrophe, but its name passed permanently into the language as a byword for delusion, for folly, for the terrible moment when an entire society agrees, all together, to believe in something that simply is not real. And its deepest lesson was written in the end, not in the ledgers of the company, but in the ruined lives of the men and women who trusted it. When the only reason a thing is rising is that it is rising, the fall is already on its way. It is always only a question of when. Sources for this account include contemporary records of the South Sea Company crisis of 1720, the parliamentary inquiries that followed its collapse, the widely documented accounts of Sir Isaac Newton's involvement and losses, and the financial histories that have preserved the story of the mania and its ruin across the centuries. In the autumn of 1976, the British government ran out of money not short of money. Not squeezed, not stretched, not facing a difficult year. Out. The nation that had once ruled a quarter of the globe, that had invented the Industrial Revolution and the modern central bank, that had stood alone against tyranny within living memory, was reduced to going, cap in hand, to an international lender of last resort and asking for the largest emergency loan that institution had ever granted to anyone on Earth. This is the story of the year Britain went bankrupt. It is a story of a currency in free fall, of a chancellor turning back from an airport runway as the pound collapsed behind him, of ministers watching the value of their nation's money drop by the hour on the dealing screens of the world. It is a story of a proud country forced to accept terms dictated from abroad in exchange for cash it could not raise on its own. And it carries a lesson that has never once stopped being relevant in any country, in any decade. A government can spend beyond its means for a very long time. It can borrow and promise and reassure and paper over the gap year after year. But the moment the people who lend it money stop believing they will be paid back, the reckoning arrives, and it arrives not gradually but all at once, and it is brutal. To understand how a nation could fall so far, you first have to understand the decade that carried it there. Because 1976 was not a lightning bolt from a clear sky. It was the culmination of years of slow decline, the moment a long sickness finally broke into a fever. To understand the full weight of what happened, you have to reach back further still to the aftermath of the Second World War. Britain had emerged from that war victorious, but it had also emerged effectively bankrupt, having poured very nearly everything it possessed into the fight for survival. In the decades that followed, it watched two things happen in parallel, and both of them wounded its pride. It watched its great empire, the largest the world had ever seen, dissolve piece by piece, colony after colony departing, until the global power that had defined the nation for centuries had simply melted away. And it watched, with a kind of disbelief, as the very nations it had defeated in the war, Germany and Japan, rebuilt themselves from rubble and then powered ahead, their factories newer, their growth faster, their industries steadily overtaking Britain's own. There was even a phrase that entered the international vocabulary to describe the country's condition, spoken with a mixture of pity and scorn: the British disease. It referred to the whole tangled malaise of the British economy, the low investment, the constant industrial strife, the seeming inability to modernize, the sense of a once great workshop of the world grown old and tired and quarrelsome. By the mid-1970s, that long decline had been running for a generation, a slow puncture in the national confidence. The crisis of 1976 did not come from nowhere. It was the moment all of that accumulated weakness, all those years of falling behind, finally arrived at the door and demanded to be paid. The 1970s were, for the British economy, something close to a nightmare that would not end. It was the decade that gave the world a new and ugly word: stagflation, the toxic combination of two things that were not supposed to happen together. Stagnation, meaning an economy that would not grow, and inflation, the relentless erosion of the value of money, both at once. For most of modern economic history, it had been assumed you could have one problem or the other, but not both. Britain in the 1970s had both in abundance, and it did not know how to cure either. The inflation alone was staggering. At its worst, prices in Britain were rising not at 2 or 3% a year, the mild figure a modern economy considers normal, but at times above 20%. Think about what that means in an ordinary life. It means the money in your pocket, the wages you worked for, lost a fifth of its buying power in a single year. It means the prices in the shops seem to change from one week to the next. It means the savings a family had carefully built up were quietly melting away, not through any fault of their own, but through the simple, grinding failure of the nation's money to hold its value. And inflation of that kind sets off a vicious spiral. Workers, watching their wages buy less and less each month, quite reasonably demanded higher pay to keep up. The great trade unions of the era, immensely powerful, went to battle for those higher wages, often successfully. But the higher wages raised the costs for businesses, which raised their prices, which fed the inflation, which prompted the next round of wage demands. Round and round it went, a wheel that would not stop turning, each turn making the next one worse. Britain seemed trapped inside a machine of its own making, unable to find the lever that would switch it off. To have lived in Britain during those years was to feel a great nation slowly coming apart at the seams. This was a decade of strikes on a scale that is difficult now to imagine. Great industries were shut down by their workers for weeks and months at a time. Only a couple of years earlier, in the winter of 1974, a strike by the coal miners, on whom the country still depended for its power, had forced the government to ration electricity so severely that industry was reduced to working only 3 days a week, and families sat at home in the dark and the cold, their lights and their heating gone. That crisis had helped bring down a government entirely. The unions, representing millions of workers, had grown so powerful that many openly wondered whether the elected government of the country, or the leaders of the great trade unions, truly held the final say over the nation's affairs. There was a pervasive, corrosive sense of a country becoming ungovernable, of institutions failing, of a proud society sliding into decline and disorder. And hanging over all of it always was that relentless inflation eating away at wages and savings and confidence alike, a daily reminder that something at the very heart of the nation's economy had gone badly and frighteningly wrong. It was against this backdrop of exhaustion and anxiety, of a country that had begun to doubt itself, that the crisis of the pound now unfolded. Beneath this, and in many ways feeding it, lay a deeper problem. For years, the British government had been spending far more than it collected in taxes. There were reasons, some of them honourable: a large welfare state to maintain, industries to support, a society that expected the government to provide. But the arithmetic was unforgiving. When a government spends more than it earns, it must cover the difference by borrowing. And to keep borrowing, year after year, it needs one thing above all else. It needs the world to keep lending. It needs investors, at home and abroad, to keep believing that Britain is a safe place to put their money, that its debts will be honoured, that its currency will hold. That belief was the quiet foundation on which the whole precarious structure rested. And in 1976, that foundation cracked, and then it gave way. The trouble revealed itself first, as it so often does, in the currency. Through the early months of the year, the pound began to slide on the foreign exchange markets, the vast global arena where the world's currencies are bought and sold. At first, it was a drift. Then it became a slide. The people who held pounds and the traders who dealt in them were slowly losing their faith that Britain could ever get its inflation and its borrowing under control. And here we arrive at the deepest truth about money, the one this entire story turns upon. A currency, in the end, is worth only what people believe it is worth. There is no vault of gold underneath it guaranteeing its value, not anymore. There is only confidence. And as confidence in the pound drained away, so inevitably did its value. The government did what governments in this position almost always do. It tried to hold the line. The Bank of England spent its precious foreign currency reserves buying up pounds, trying to prop up the price by force, to create demand where the market was providing only supply. It is a defense that history has shown to fail again and again, because no central bank's reserves are a match for the combined weight of a market that has decided a currency must fall. And so it proved. The reserves drained away, and still the pound sank. Then came the single most humiliating image of the entire affair, a moment that burned itself into the nation's memory. In the summer, as a fresh wave of selling hit the pound, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the man responsible for the nation's finances, a formidable politician named Dennis Healey, was at the airport, about to board a flight to an important international meeting. And the crisis was so acute, the collapse of the pound so alarming that he could not go. He turned around on the tarmac, abandoned the trip, and drove back to deal with the emergency. The Chancellor of one of the great economies of the world, unable even to leave the country, because its money was falling apart in his absence. It was a picture of a nation in crisis, and everyone understood exactly what it meant. By the early autumn, the situation had passed from serious to desperate. The pound had fallen to a level that would have seemed impossible only a few years before, and the fall itself had become the engine of further panic, in the cruel feedback loop that lies at the heart of every currency crisis. Every drop in the pound convinced more of the people who held it to sell before it dropped further, and every wave of selling drove it down again, which triggered the next. The market had scented blood, and it would not let go. For a country like Britain, which imported a great deal of its food, its fuel, and its raw materials, a collapsing currency was not some abstract figure on a screen. It was a direct assault on daily life. When the pound falls, everything the country buys from abroad becomes more expensive, which meant the price of imported goods was rising sharply, which fed directly back into the very inflation that had helped start the crisis in the first place. Every problem was worsening every other problem. Britain was caught in a trap where each wall was closing in on all the others. And the government that had to face this had almost no room to maneuver. It was a Labour government led by James Callaghan, and it governed with the barest sliver of a majority in Parliament, at times with no majority at all, dependent on deals with smaller parties simply to survive from one vote to the next. A weak government facing the strongest of storms. Every day brought fresh reports on the dealing screens, the pound ticking lower, and every fall was reported in the newspapers of the world, so that Britain's humiliation was played out not in private, but in the full and merciless glare of international attention. Foreign commentators wrote openly about the sick man of Europe, about whether Britain was becoming ungovernable, about whether a great power was witnessing its own final decline. For a nation with Britain's history and Britain's pride, This drumbeat of global pity and contempt was its own kind of torture. The ministers responsible could feel the ground moving beneath them, could sense that events were slipping beyond anyone's control, and could find no lever, no policy, no speech that would restore the confidence that was draining away by the hour. They were, in the truest sense, running out of options, and they knew it. And so, the government arrived at the decision it had dreaded above all others. It concluded that it had no choice but to seek a loan from the International Monetary Fund, the body the nations of the world had created precisely to rescue countries whose finances had collapsed. For Britain, this was a moment of the deepest national shame. The fund was where struggling economies went, the developing nations, the countries that had lost control. It was emphatically not where one of the founding powers of the entire modern financial system, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a nuclear power, expected to find itself standing in line for a bailout. But the money had run out, and pride, whatever else may be said of it, does not pay a nation's creditors. What made the humiliation sharper still was the sheer scale of it. The loan Britain sought was the largest the International Monetary Fund had ever been asked to provide to anyone in its history. This was not a country with a small, manageable problem. This was a great industrial nation, in the full glare of the world's attention, admitting that it could no longer fund itself. The negotiations that followed were among the most dramatic in the nation's peacetime history. A team from the International Monetary Fund arrived in London to examine Britain's books, to sit across the table from British ministers and dictate the conditions of the rescue. Imagine the scene. Officials from an international body poring over the accounts of the British state, deciding line by line what could be spent and what must be cut, while the government of the day waited on their verdict like a defendant awaiting sentence. The fund's demands were severe, and the sums involved in the argument were enormous, and the whole affair had to be conducted under a terrible pressure of time, because with every day that passed without an agreement, confidence ebbed further, and the pound sank lower, which made the eventual terms harsher still. It was a negotiation conducted with a knife at the nation's throat, and everyone in the room knew it. Dennis Healey, the Chancellor, a man of famous toughness and intellect, found himself fighting on two fronts at once, battling the fund on one side for less punishing terms, and battling his own colleagues on the other to accept whatever terms could be won. He would later describe this period as the most harrowing of his entire political life, and few who lived through it would disagree. The very survival of the government hung in the balance, for if the cabinet split apart over the terms, the administration itself might fall, and Britain would be left leaderless in the midst of the worst financial crisis it had known in living memory. But the deepest wound was not the shame of asking, it was the price of receiving, because the International Monetary Fund did not simply hand over the cash and wish Britain well. It attached conditions, strict and painful ones. In exchange for the loan, it demanded that Britain slash its government spending sharply and immediately, and bring its runaway borrowing under control, and consider what that truly meant. It meant that a group of international officials answerable to no British voter, accountable to no British Parliament, were now effectively setting the limits of British budgets. They would decide in their negotiations how much the British government could spend on its own people. The sovereignty of Parliament over the nation's own purse, one of the oldest and most fiercely guarded principles in the whole of British history, a principle men had fought and died for across the centuries, had been quietly pawned in exchange for a loan. Inside the government, the demand tore the ruling party very nearly in half. On one side stood those, largely on the political left, who argued that the cuts were a betrayal of everything they had entered politics to defend, that a government should spend to protect jobs and public services and the vulnerable, no matter the cost, and that to bow to the fund was to surrender the nation's soul along with its sovereignty. On the other side stood those, more pragmatic or more resigned, who argued with grim arithmetic that there was simply no alternative left, that a country which cannot fund itself must, in the end, accept the terms of those who will fund it, however bitter. The argument raged for weeks, in long and exhausting cabinet meetings, in a government fighting for its life, while outside the door the markets watched and waited, and the clock ran down. In the end, the realists prevailed, because the arithmetic left no other door open. Britain accepted the terms. It agreed to the cuts. It took the loan. And then, slowly and painfully, something unexpected happened. The crisis began to lift. The very act of accepting the fund's discipline, of signalling to the world that Britain would, at last, bring its finances under control, began to restore the one thing that had been draining away all along: confidence. The pound, having found a floor, steadied, the panic subsided, and in a final, almost mocking irony, it turned out that Britain did not even need the full amount of the enormous loan it had been so desperate to secure. As the situation improved, much of it was never drawn down at all, and what had been borrowed was repaid ahead of schedule. And Britain, as it happened, had one more card to play, one that fate had dealt it at almost precisely the right moment. For beneath the cold grey waters of the North Sea, off the nation's coast, vast reserves of oil had been discovered, and in the very years around the crisis they were beginning to flow. It was an extraordinary stroke of timing. Just as the old industrial economy seemed to be failing, just as the nation's finances had collapsed into the arms of the International Monetary Fund, a river of oil, and of the money that oil would bring, was beginning to come ashore. Over the years that followed, North Sea oil would transform Britain's balance sheet, turning the country from an importer of energy into a producer of it, pouring revenue into the treasury and strength into the pound. It did not cause the recovery from 1976 on its own, but it underwrote it. It gave the nation breathing room it had not earned and could scarcely have expected, a windfall from beneath the sea that helped a bankrupt country back onto its feet. There is a certain irony in it. The same decade that saw Britain reduced to begging also saw it handed one of the great natural fortunes of modern history. The crisis and the salvation arrived, almost hand in hand. But it would be a mistake to let the recovery soften the lesson, because the lesson is the thing that lasts. Oil or no oil, Britain, in 1976, had looked over the edge of a cliff. It had discovered, in the most public and humiliating way imaginable, that there is a hard limit to how long a nation can live beyond its means, and that the limit is set not by the nation itself, but by the cold judgment of everyone who lends it money. That judgment can be delayed, it can be argued with, it can be softened for a time by luck or by oil or by clever words. But it cannot be escaped forever. Sooner or later the accounts are called in and the reckoning comes. But if the immediate financial crisis passed, its consequences did not. They ran deep and they ran long, reshaping the country for a generation. For the scar of 1976 never truly faded from the national memory. The image of Britain going bankrupt, of the Chancellor turning back at the airport, of a great nation reduced to begging, lodged itself permanently in the mind of the political class. It became a kind of ghost that haunted every future debate about spending and borrowing and the value of the pound. More than that, many historians mark 1976 as a genuine turning point, the year the old political consensus that had governed Britain since the Second World War began to die. For 30 years, both major parties had broadly agreed on a model of a large, active, spending state. The catastrophe of 1976 shattered the confidence of that model to its foundations. It suggested to a great many people that the old way had reached the end of the road, that a government could not simply spend and borrow without limit, that the disciplines the fund had imposed from outside would have to be imposed in future from within. Within a few short years, a new kind of politics, harder-edged, more suspicious of state spending, obsessed with controlling inflation and the money supply, would sweep into power and govern Britain for a generation. The seeds of that revolution were planted in no small part in the humiliation of that autumn. The intellectual shift can be heard in a single, remarkable moment. At his own party's conference, in the very thick of the crisis, Prime Minister James Callaghan stood up and said something that would have been almost unthinkable from a Labour leader only a few years before. He told his party, in effect, that the old idea that a government could simply spend its way out of a recession, that it could borrow and spend to keep everyone in work no matter the cost, was an option that no longer existed, if indeed it ever had. It was an extraordinary admission, a leader of the left publicly burying one of the central beliefs of his own movement. And it captured the deeper meaning of 1976. The crisis had not just emptied the nation's coffers. It had shattered a way of thinking, an entire post-war consensus about the role of the state that had governed Britain for 3 decades. Into the vacuum left behind rushed a different set of ideas, a fierce new focus on controlling the money supply, on taming inflation above all other goals, on shrinking the reach of the state, ideas that would define the politics of the following decade and beyond. And the lesson reached far beyond Britain's shores, for Britain was neither the first nor the last nation to make that long walk to the International Monetary Fund. Country after country, across the decades and the continents, has found itself in that same terrible position, its currency collapsing, its lenders fleeing, forced to accept the discipline of outsiders as the price of survival. The details change. The currency is different. The decade is different. The particular follies that led to the crisis are different, but the shape of the story is always, hauntingly, the same. It is the story of what happens when a nation loses the confidence of the people who fund it. And Britain's ordeal in 1976 stands as one of the starkest warnings of all, precisely because it happened not to some small or fragile economy, but to one of the oldest and proudest financial powers on earth. If it could happen to Britain, the lesson runs, it can happen to anyone. There is a deeper truth underneath the whole affair, and it is worth stating as plainly as it can be stated, because it applies far beyond Britain and far beyond the 1970s. A country does not go bankrupt in a single day. It never does. It goes bankrupt slowly, invisibly, Through years and years of spending a little more than it earns, of promising its people a little more than it can truly deliver, of borrowing on the quiet assumption that the lenders will always be there tomorrow. The decline is so gradual that almost no one notices it happening. And then, one autumn, the assumption simply fails. The lenders look up from their desks, and they study the numbers, and they look at the falling currency, and they make a cold and collective decision that they are no longer certain of being paid back. And in that single instant, the slow, invisible crisis of an entire decade becomes the sudden, screaming emergency of one season. Britain learned that lesson in 1976, and it paid for the education with a loan, a great deal of its pride, and a permanent place in the nightmares of every chancellor who followed. The money had simply run out. And when a nation's money runs out, the hard and unchangeable truth is this: the terms are no longer set at home. They are set by someone else. Sources for this account include contemporary reporting by the BBC and the British press on the 1976 sterling crisis, the published records of the negotiations between the United Kingdom and the International Monetary Fund, the official documents of the period released in later years, and the memoirs and testimony of the ministers and officials who lived through it. In 1945, in the last weeks of the Second World War, a convoy of trucks wound its way through the Austrian Alps under SS Guard. When the war ended days later, crates from those trucks were hauled out of a lake called Toplitz, and inside them, investigators found money. British money! £5 notes, £10 notes, 20s and 50s, in quantities that made no sense. When the Bank of England examined them, the verdict was worse than anyone had imagined. They were perfect. What lay at the bottom of that alpine lake was the largest counterfeiting operation in the history of money. £134 million of forged sterling, billions in today's money, manufactured by the Nazi state with a single purpose: not to spend. To destroy. The plan was to rain banknotes over Britain until the pound itself collapsed, and with it, the country's ability to fight. This is the story of Operation Bernhard, the secret factory inside a concentration camp, the prisoners who forged for their lives, the notes so flawless the Bank of England itself could not tell them from its own, and the quiet, decades-long cover-up that followed, because the most dangerous attack on Britain in the Second World War was not aimed at its cities. It was aimed at its money. To understand why a forged banknote could be a weapon of war, you have to understand what a banknote actually is, and what it is a promise. A £5 note in 1939 was not worth £5 of anything. It was a piece of paper on which the Bank of England promised to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £5. The entire machinery of British commerce, wages, savings, trade across the empire, ran on the belief that the promise was good and the paper was real. And that belief was the target. Flood a country with notes it cannot tell from its own, and every transaction becomes a question. Shopkeepers hesitate. Banks refuse. Savings become suspect. Money only works while nobody has to think about it. And the moment everyone has to think about it, it stops working entirely. Run the arithmetic of the attack, and its ambition comes into focus. Britain's entire war effort ran on confidence in sterling. The loans that built the bombers, the imports that fed the island, the empire's trade, all of it denominated in the promise. The planners reckoned that even a partial success would force Britain into an impossible choice: honor every note presented, genuine or not, and bleed, or refuse suspect notes and teach every citizen that the money in their own pocket might be worthless. The first option cost treasure. The second cost the thing treasure stands on. There was no third option, which is what made a printing press, in this one specific application, a strategic weapon in the same class as a bomber fleet at 1,000th of the price. They even wargamed the delivery. The aircraft chosen for the drops were assessed, the bundle sizes tested, the release altitudes debated, notes scattered differently from bombs, and a bale that lands unopened in a field defeats the purpose. The plan called for the notes to fall over the industrial north and the countryside, where a farm labourer finding a fiver in a hedgerow, a week's wages blown in on the wind, would face a temptation the planners considered no rationing-era Britain could resist. They were probably right. The weapon was never fired, but no one has ever seriously argued it was badly aimed. The Germans understood this perfectly because it had happened to them. In 1923, Germany's own currency had died of a different disease, hyperinflation, and the men who watched wheelbarrows of marks buy a single loaf of bread never forgot what a country looks like when its money fails. Now, they intended to inflict that failure on their enemy, deliberately, from the air. The idea surfaced within weeks of the war beginning. In September 1939, a meeting in Berlin's finance ministry heard a proposal of elegant brutality: forge the pound sterling on an industrial scale, drop it from aircraft over Britain, and let greed do the rest. People would pick the notes up. Of course they would, and every note spent would push the poison deeper into the bloodstream of British commerce. There were objections, and they are revealing. The head of the Reichsbank protested, not on moral grounds but professional ones. Counterfeiting another nation's currency was an attack on the idea of money itself, and Germany's own money lived in the same glass house. He was overruled. The economists calculated that if even a fraction of the forged notes entered circulation, British prices would surge, the pound's exchange rate would buckle, and, the detail they savoured most, every genuine note would become suspect. The forgery did not need to replace the pound. It only needed to make the pound doubt itself. The plan acquired a name, a budget, and a patron in the SS. What it needed was the impossible, a perfect copy of the hardest banknote on earth to forge. The first attempt was a fiasco worth pausing on, because its failure explains everything the second attempt did differently. Operation Andreas, launched in 1940, was staffed the conventional way, with loyal technicians, civil servants, and printing engineers recruited for their politics as much as their craft. They worked for 2 years in a Berlin workshop, and they produced notes that were good. Good was worthless. The paper never felt right, the watermark never held its subtlety, and the operation dissolved in bureaucratic squabbling with almost nothing usable to show. The lesson the SS drew was cold and correct. Patriots could not do this work. Craftsmen could, and the greatest craftsmen available were the ones the Reich had imprisoned. There was also the question of the paper itself, and it nearly defeated them twice. British notepaper was linen rag, but not any linen. The Germans eventually concluded the British used Rami fibre, and even then the first German sheets failed the field test, too new, too clean. The solution was grimly inventive. The linen was used, washed, and worked before pulping because Britain's paper was made partly from rag that had lived a life. A dedicated mill was turned over to the problem, running trial after trial until the sheets crackled like Threadneedle Street's own. The British white fiver was not just a piece of paper, it was a fortress of Victorian engineering. The paper itself was made from linen rag with a distinctive feel, crisp, almost crackling, produced to a secret recipe. Within it ran a watermark of extraordinary subtlety, visible only when held to the light. The printing was intaglio, ink standing proud of the paper in microscopic ridges, and woven through the design sat traps, tiny deliberate imperfections, minute breaks in lines, a dot misplaced by a fraction of a millimeter, placed there so the bank's own inspectors could recognize their children and catch anyone else's. The first German attempts failed exactly as the bank intended. The paper felt wrong, the watermark blurred. The traps went unnoticed. A forgery that is nearly perfect is worthless, because a suspicious clerk with a magnifying glass is the whole of the defense. Then, in 1942, the operation passed to a man named Bernhard Kruger, an SS major with a background in textile engineering and a bureaucrat's patience. Kruger's insight was the one that gives this story its darkness and its strange humanity. The finest printers, engravers, and paper specialists in occupied Europe were already in German hands. They were in the camps. Kruger toured the concentration camps of the Reich with a recruiting list. Printers, lithographers, engravers, bankers, paper chemists, and forgers, professional criminals who had spent their lives copying other people's money. 142 men, most of them Jewish prisoners, were pulled from the general camps and delivered to 2 sealed barracks at Sachsenhausen, north of Berlin. Blocks 18 and 19, fenced off from the rest of the camp, windows painted over, entry forbidden even to most of the SS. Among them were men whose lives read like the story itself. Adolf Berger was a Slovak typographer arrested for printing false baptismal certificates to save Jews from deportation, a forger of mercy, now ordered to forge for the Reich. He survived to write the book that told the world. And in 1944, the operation acquired its strangest recruit of all, Salomon Smolyanov, the only professional criminal in the group, a Russian master counterfeiter whose pre-war forgeries of the very same British notes had been good enough to earn him files at Scotland Yard and a conviction in 3 countries. The SS had spent years hunting counterfeiters as criminals. Now they collected one as a consultant. Inside those barracks, the deal was never written down but understood by every man: forge perfectly and live, fail and return to the machinery of death outside the fence. It was a bargain of exquisite cruelty, and the prisoners understood its arithmetic better than their captors. Work too slowly, and the SS had no reason to keep you. Finish too completely, and the SS had no reason to keep you either. The only survivable path was excellence without completion, indispensable today, unfinished tomorrow. Some of the men, Berger among them, later admitted to quiet sabotage at the margins. A delayed batch here, a technical difficulty carefully overstated there. Stretching the work was not laziness. It was the only clock they controlled. The prisoners of Block 19 solved the unsolvable piece by piece. The linen paper was reverse engineered down to its rag content and its feel. The watermark took months of trial. The solution required rebuilding the paper molds themselves. The intaglio plates were engraved by hand, line by line, under magnification. And the traps, the bank's secret imperfections, were found, catalogued, and faithfully copied, every deliberate flaw reproduced as lovingly as the design itself. Then came the aging. New money is suspicious money. So the prisoners dirtied their perfect notes, crumpled them, walked on them, passed them hand to hand around the barracks, pinned them through with bank pins as British clerks did, and penciled sums in the margins. The final touch was a masterpiece of psychology. The forgers sorted their own output into grades, the flawless notes reserved for the most dangerous work, the slightly imperfect for ordinary spending, and the failures burned. By 1943, the factory inside Block 19 was running like a mint. At its peak, it produced as many as 650,000 notes a month. Over its lifetime, Operation Bernhard printed roughly 9 million notes, £134 million. To measure that, it approached 10% of all the sterling banknotes then in circulation. The test came in 1943, and it remains one of the most audacious moments in the history of forgery. The Germans needed to know, would the notes survive expert inspection? So an agent walked into a Swiss bank with a bundle of Bernhard fivers and asked, with a straight face, for them to be checked. He had doubts, he said, about their authenticity. The Swiss examined them and pronounced them genuine. Not satisfied, the Germans pushed further. The notes were sent on for the Bank of England's own opinion. The bank looked at the finest forgeries ever made of its own currency and certified them as real. And yet the bombers never came. The original vision, blizzards of bank notes drifting down over English towns, died quietly, for the most practical of reasons. By the time the notes were perfect, the Luftwaffe no longer commanded British skies. A weapon designed to fall from aircraft had outlived the aircraft. So the money found other work, and this is where the operation turned from a weapon into a machine. The SS began spending it. Forged sterling paid for intelligence networks across occupied Europe. It bought weapons, paid informants, and helped fund the commando raid that lifted Mussolini off his mountain prison in 1943. It flowed through money changers in Lisbon, Istanbul, Zurich, and Stockholm, wherever neutral markets asked no questions. The distribution itself became an industry with its own strange aristocracy. Its master was a Bavarian businessman named Friedrich Schwend, a money launderer of genius who ran the operation like a franchise from a requisitioned castle in northern Italy. Schwend's network of agents and sub-agents, smugglers, diplomats, black market brokers across a dozen countries, moved the forged notes into circulation and took their cut in real money. He was paid a third of the face value of everything he laundered. His salesmen carried sterling in false-bottomed suitcases across every neutral border in Europe. At the height of the operation, the SS was, in effect, running the largest money laundering business in history, with a criminal's commission structure and a government's printing press. Consider what Schwend's franchise actually was, because nothing like it has existed before or since. Sellers moved notes down a hierarchy of distributors, each layer buying sterling at a deeper discount and selling it up the chain closer to face value, the margin structure of a smuggling cartel applied to the currency of the enemy. Payment to the network came in genuine money, goods, gold, jewels, anything real. The SS was, quite literally, converting fiction into fact. Paper that cost pennies to print, exchanged across Europe for actual trucks, actual weapons, actual gold. Seen coldly, Operation Bernhard's second life was one of the most profitable business operations of the war. Profits conjured from a printing press and other people's belief. And notes flowed to stranger places still. Partisans in the Balkans were bought off with forged pounds. Border guards were bribed with them. There are accounts of the money being used to fund escape lines for Nazi officials as the war turned, the forgeries that had been made to destroy Britain ending their war, smuggling their makers' colleagues to safety. The most famous German spy of the war, a valet inside the British embassy in Ankara, codenamed Cicero, photographed British secrets and was paid some £300,000 for them. Almost every note of it was forged. The Germans paid their greatest spy in their own fake money and never told him. By 1944, Bernhard notes were so widespread in the Mediterranean that black market traders in some cities quoted two prices for sterling, one for notes above suspicion and a discount for notes that might have passed through German hands. The pound's reputation, the promise printed on every note, was being quietly poisoned, exactly as the planners had intended, just more slowly and less visibly than a blizzard from the sky. London knew something was wrong. Warnings had reached the Bank of England within weeks of the war starting. The first tip came from a source in Switzerland before the operation had printed a single usable note. For years afterwards, the danger remained theoretical. Rumours, fragments, the occasional clumsy fake. Then, in 1943, a note came home to roost in the most ordinary way imaginable, a British bank, processing a deposit that traced back through a neutral country, flagged a fiver whose serial number told an impossible story. The bank's ledgers showed that note number already accounted for. Two identical serial numbers meant one thing. Somewhere, someone was printing pounds so well that only the bookkeeping could catch them. That was the true nightmare revealed. The forgeries could not be detected as objects. They could only be detected as arithmetic, duplicate serials, impossible dates, notes reported destroyed that walked in through the door. The defense of the pound retreated from the magnifying glass to the ledger. By 1943, the evidence was undeniable. Forgeries were surfacing that the bank's own experts could barely fault. In the bank's private ledgers, a special account was opened to track them. The staff who maintained it called the entries by a deliberately bland name, the German Notes, and the account was one of the most closely guarded secrets in Threadneedle Street. The response tells you how seriously they took it. The bank did something it had never done in 2.5 centuries. It retreated. It stopped issuing the great white notes above £5, the 10s, the 20s, the 50s, and pulled them from circulation. The pound's first line of defense had failed, so the bank simply abolished the battlefield. The public was told almost nothing. The full scale of the operation, the fact that an enemy state had achieved a near-perfect forgery of the national currency, stayed out of the newspapers during the war and stayed quiet for years after it. When a currency's defense is belief, you do not advertise that the belief was broken. And in the sealed barracks, the machine was already being aimed at a second target. In 1944, Kruger ordered the forgers to begin work on the United States dollar. The dollar was a different fortress, different paper, different printing, a different set of traps, and the prisoners, reading the war news in the quality of their rations, understood that this new impossible task was also a new lease on life. Smolyanov and a small team labored over the $100 bill for a year, solving it the way they had solved the fiver: paper, plates, patience. By early 1945, they had produced test sheets that the team judged good enough to pass. The full print run was scheduled. The Reich collapsed before the presses could turn. The dollar survived Operation Bernhard by a margin of weeks. Inside Sachsenhausen, the war was ending, and the prisoners of Blocks 18 and 19 understood exactly what their perfection had earned them. They were among the most dangerous witnesses in Europe. Men who knew how to destroy a currency could not be allowed to meet the Allies. In the spring of 1945, the operation was dismantled, the plates and papers crated, and the forgers loaded onto transports south, bound, they were certain, for execution. What saved them was the machinery of collapse itself. The Reich was disintegrating faster than its own orders could travel. Guards deserted. Transports stalled on broken railways. At the last camp, deep in Austria, the men assigned to liquidate the forgers ran out of time and ran for their own lives. In May 1945, American soldiers found the men of Operation Bernhard alive. Nearly every one of the 142 had survived the war inside the most secret room of the Reich. The evidence went into the lake. Crates of notes, plates, and records were sunk in Lake Toplitz, deep in the Austrian Alps, a lake chosen with care. Over 100 meters deep, its lower waters starved of oxygen, so that whatever sank would neither rot nor surface. The lake kept its secret badly, and everyone who went looking found more story than treasure. In 1959, the German magazine Stern quietly funded a diving expedition. Out of the black water came 15 crates of sodden, perfect fivers, and something far more dangerous, the operation's own ledgers. Sodden but legible, recording serial runs and transactions, naming names that several comfortably living ex-SS men very much preferred unnamed. The magazine's scoop rattled half of Europe, and the whispers began that other crates held other lists. The lake began to collect legends and then bodies. In 1963, a 19-year-old diver on an unauthorized treasure hunt died in the dark water. The expedition behind it traced back to men with wartime pasts, and Austria banned diving in Toplitz outright. The bans never quite held. Decade after decade, the expeditions returned. Sonar sweeps, submersibles, television-funded searches. In 2000, an American team with a research submarine spent weeks on the bottom and came up with more crates of notes, the paper preserved almost perfectly by the lake's oxygen-starved depths, as if the operation had closed the day before. Treasure hunters still petition to dive it today, chasing gold that was never there. The paper was the treasure, and the paper was the weapon. The notes that never sank had their own strange afterlife. For years after the war, Bernhard fivers kept surfacing in the world's money, in bank deposits, in market stalls, in bureaux de change from Cairo to Buenos Aires, and the Bank of England quietly absorbed the blow, withdrawing suspect notes as they appeared and destroying them, unwilling to punish whoever happened to be holding the parcel when the music stopped. A few specimens were kept, catalogued, and locked away. Today they sit in the bank's own museum, the finest forgeries ever made, preserved by their victim as a professional compliment. And the men walked into their endings. Kruger passed through 2 post-war tribunals, and at both, the testimony that shielded him came from his own former prisoners, men with every reason to hate the SS, telling the plain truth that his factory had been the reason they lived. Whatever one makes of that arithmetic, the tribunals accepted it. He gave a single television interview late in life, unrepentant and precise, the bureaucrat to the end. The fates of the men complete the ledger. Friedrich Schwend, the money launderer, slipped to South America and ran his talents for hire for decades before dying poor. The middleman's fortune, like his merchandise, proved counterfeit. Bernhard Kruger, the operation's architect, was held, questioned, and never prosecuted. Counterfeiting an enemy's currency in wartime, it turned out, fitted no article of the war crimes charters, and several of his former prisoners testified, truthfully, that his factory had kept them alive. He died in 1989, having spent part of his later career with no apparent sense of irony working for a paper company. Salomon Smolyanov, the master forger, emigrated to South America and finished his days making toys. And Adolf Berger spent half a century telling the story. His memoir became the Austrian film The Counterfeiters, which in 2008 won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film and put Block 19 on the world's screens. Count the cost, and the strange verdict of Operation Bernhard emerges. As a weapon, it failed. The pound did not collapse, and the blizzard of banknotes never fell. As a forgery, it was the most successful in history. 9 million notes pronounced genuine by their own victim. And as an attack on trust, it left a mark that outlasted the war by a generation. The Bank of England did not put a £10 note back into circulation until 1964, 19 years after the war ended. For 2 decades, the largest banknote in Britain was the fiver, and the reason lay at the bottom of an Austrian lake. The white fiver itself, the elegant Victorian promise that had circulated for generations, was retired in 1957, replaced by a smaller, more defensible design. The forgers of Block 19 had not destroyed the pound. They had destroyed the pound's innocence. And here is the uncomfortable mirror that completes the story. Britain knew this weapon intimately because Britain had used it. During the American Revolution, British forces counterfeited the continental dollar on an industrial scale, advertising in New York newspapers for paper and printers, shipping forged notes into the rebel colonies by the trunkload. The Continental collapsed. Not worth a Continental entered the language, and though bad rebel finance did most of the killing, London's forgeries helped dig the grave. A century before that, revolutionary France's assignats were forged from British soil with the government's knowledge. Napoleon, in his turn, forged Russian rubles and Austrian notes for his campaigns. Currency warfare was not a Nazi invention. It is as old as paper money itself, a standing temptation for any power at war with a country whose money is made of promises. What Operation Bernhard added was only scale and perfection. The first time the weapon was built on a production line aimed at the strongest currency on Earth, and made so well that the victim certified the ammunition. The Bank of England understood that mirror perfectly. which may be the deepest reason the whole affair stayed so quiet for so long. There are attacks a central bank does not discuss, partly because discussing them teaches the method, and partly because the method has old fingerprints on it. So, what does Operation Bernhard teach, nearly a century on? That money is a promise, and promises can be attacked. That the real defense of a currency was never the watermark or the paper, those were copied, but the willingness of its institutions to retreat, adapt, and absorb the blow in silence. That the same machinery can print value or destroy it, depending only on whose hands hold the plates. And that the most effective financial weapons are the ones nobody sees working. The pound was under industrial attack for 5 years, and the quietness of the defense was the defense. Every banknote in your pocket still carries the same promise the white fiver carried. It works because you never have to think about it. In 1945, at the bottom of an alpine lake, lay 134 million reasons to think about it. Sources for this account include the Bank of England's released wartime records on forgery, post-war interrogation records, the published memoir of Sachsenhausen forger Adolf Berger, the recovered Toplitz ledgers and expedition records, and the documented history of the Schwend distribution network. By 1803, the largest European commanded army on Earth outside Europe, roughly 260,000 men, about twice the size of the British Army of the day, did not answer to a king, a parliament, or a nation. It answered to a company. A private, profit-seeking, shareholder-owned company, run from a modest building in the City of London by a permanent staff so small, 35 clerks, by one count in the 1780s, that the whole head office of the most powerful corporation in history could have fitted on a single omnibus. That company collected the taxes of some 20 million people. It minted its own coin, flew its own flag, ran its own courts, made its own treaties, and fought its own wars. And when it overreached and ran out of money in the summer of 1772, it did not die the way companies die. It was rescued the way states are rescued, with public money, on the argument that its failure would take the country down with it. It was the first corporation in history that was too big to fail, and the bill for saving it helped cost Britain America. This is the story of the East India Company, how a syndicate of Elizabethan merchants accidentally invented the immortal corporation, how a trading firm's clerks ended up conquering a subcontinent, how its bailout lit the fuse of the American Revolution, and how a government spent 80 years slowly swallowing the monster it had chartered. Because every modern argument about corporate power, every bailout, every monopoly hearing, every uneasy question about companies grown larger than the countries that host them, was rehearsed in full 2 centuries before anyone said the words "too big to fail." It begins with spice and a piece of paper. On the 31st of December 1600, the last day of the 16th century, Queen Elizabeth I put her seal to a royal charter for 218 London merchants, calling themselves the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. The charter granted them a monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, half the commercial world, on paper, handed to a private club. Their starting capital was a little over £68,000, a respectable sum, and utterly absurd against what it would become. The prize was spice, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, mace, grown on a handful of islands in what is now Indonesia, and worth many times their weight in silver by the time they reached a London table. A single successful voyage could pay for itself several times over. The problem was that a single unsuccessful voyage, and the route around the Cape killed ships routinely, could ruin every man who had backed it. The solution to that problem is the reason this video exists, and it is the company's first and greatest invention. Instead of one merchant risking one fortune on one ship, hundreds of investors each bought a small share of the whole venture. No single backer could be ruined. No single shipwreck could end the enterprise. At first, each voyage was a separate fund, subscribed, sailed, sold, and wound up, with the profits handed back. But winding up a trading empire every few years was madness, and in 1657, the company made the leap that changed everything: a permanent joint stock. The capital would never be handed back. If an investor wanted out, he did not ask the company for his money. He sold his share to someone else. Stop and look at what that means, because it is the DNA of the entire modern economy. A business that no longer depends on any particular investor, any particular ship, any particular man. The people die. The capital lives. Shares become things you trade rather than redeem, which means shares acquire a price, which means a market must exist to set it. The joint stock company with permanent capital is, quite simply, the invention of the immortal business. And immortality, it turns out, changes what a business can want. A merchant plans for his lifetime. A permanent corporation can plan for conquest. But conquest came later. First came humiliation, because the company lost the spice race badly. The Dutch had founded their own East India Company in 1602, capitalized at many times the English level, and the Dutch played rough. In 1623, on the island of Amboina, Dutch officials seized and executed 10 of the English company's merchants, and English power in the Spice Islands effectively died with them. In 1667, under the Treaty of Breda, England formally surrendered its claim to Run, a nutmeg island it had clung to for decades. As part of the same settlement, the Dutch let England keep a different island, one their rivals had seized in America a few years earlier, a place called Manhattan. At the time, most observers reckoned the Dutch had kept the better rock. So the English company, beaten in Indonesia, fell back on its second choice, India. And this is where it turns. India did not have spice islands. It had something better, the finest, cheapest textiles on earth. Calico, chintz, muslin, cottons woven to a quality Europe could not touch, at prices Europe could not believe. The company set up trading posts, a factory at Surat by 1613, Madras from 1639, Calcutta from 1690. Bombay it acquired by a route so English it hurts. The island came to King Charles II in 1661 as part of his Portuguese bride's dowry, and in 1668 he leased it to the company for £10 a year. Indian cotton conquered the English wardrobe so completely that Parliament, protecting the wool trade, banned printed calicos outright in the early 1700s. The company shrugged and pivoted its imports again to a Chinese leaf that would end up financing a fifth of this story, tea. And all the while, almost unnoticed, the company was acquiring the habits of a state. Its trading posts sat inside fortified walls because 17th century trade needed defending. Successive royal charters granted it the right to fortify, to mint coin, to raise troops, to exercise justice, and to make war and peace east of the Cape. Each power made commercial sense on the day it was granted. Nobody sat down and decided to create an armed sovereign corporation. It assembled itself, clause by reasonable clause, until, by the 1750s, the company kept small private armies of Indian soldiers, sepoys, drilled in European methods, guarding warehouses full of cloth. Hold that thought, a company with an army, because in 1756 it stopped being a curiosity. That June, the young new ruler of Bengal, the Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah, furious at the company's fortifications and its abuse of trading privileges, marched on Calcutta and took it in days. British prisoners died in a crowded cell in the aftermath, an episode inflated by propaganda at the time and disputed by historians ever since. And the trading company, faced with the loss of its richest trade, had to decide what it actually was. It decided it was a power. The man who made the decision had joined the company at 18 as a writer, the company's word for a junior clerk, a boy who copied invoices. His name was Robert Clive, and he had discovered in the company's small wars in southern India that he was a clerk with a talent for soldiering. In January 1757, he retook Calcutta. And then, instead of settling back into trade, he reached for something no company had ever done. What happened next is usually called the Battle of Plassey. It would be more honest to call it the Purchase of Bengal. Bengal's great bankers, the house of the Jagat Seths, financiers to the Nawab's own government, had turned against Siraj-ud-Dowlah, and with the company, they assembled a conspiracy. The Nawab's own army commander, Mir Jafar, would be installed in his place in exchange for staggering payments to the company and its servants. The battle itself, on the 23rd of June 1757, was almost a formality. Clive commanded around 3,000 men, most of them sepoys. Estimates put the Nawab's army at around 50,000, but a monsoon downpour soaked the Nawab's gunpowder while the company's gunners covered theirs, and Mir Jafar, commanding the largest part of the Nawab's force, simply stood and watched. By evening, the Nawab's army had dissolved. The company's casualties were counted in dozens. It was less a battle than a transaction with cannon attached, bought before it was fought. Then came the settlement, and the settlement is the point. The new Nawab, Mir Jafar, owed his throne to a corporation, and the corporation invoiced him for it. By the company's own accounts, well over £2 million flowed out of the Bengal treasury in compensation and gifts, much of it carried down the river to Calcutta in a flotilla of boats. Clive personally took around £234,000, plus a land revenue grant worth roughly $27,000 a year for life, making the former clerk one of the richest men in Britain in an afternoon. It is around this period that a Hindustani word for plunder began its migration into the English language, loot. But that was not the strangest part. The strangest part came 8 years later, in a tent. The company's new position in Bengal dragged it into more war, and in 1764, at Buxar, its sepoy army defeated a combined force that included the Mughal emperor himself, Shah Alam II. The emperor, a ruler with immense prestige and almost no power, then did something with no precedent in the history of either empires or commerce. On the 12th of August 1765, at Allahabad, in a ceremony conducted, by several contemporary accounts, in Clive's tent, with an armchair hoisted onto a dining table for a throne. Shah Alam granted the East India Company the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, the legal right to collect the land revenue of the richest provinces of India. Read that again, the way London's investors did. A corporation had acquired the taxes of some 20 million people, a revenue stream estimated at between £2 and £3 million a year, at a time when the entire tax revenue of Great Britain was around 10 million. And the machine the company built on top of it was elegant and extractive in equal measure. Bengal's taxes were used to buy Bengal's goods, which were shipped to London and sold at profit. The company called this its investment. Strip the accounting language away, and Bengal was now paying for its own export. Trade had become tribute with a ledger. London went mad for it. East India stock soared. The company raised its dividend to 12.5%. Returning company men, the papers called them nabobs from Nawab, came home with fortunes and bought country estates and seats in Parliament. The government, watching a private company swallow the revenues of provinces, extracted its cut the polite way. From 1767, the company agreed to pay the Treasury £400,000 a year for the privilege of keeping its territories. Note the shape of that deal, because it will decide everything later. The state was now a paying stakeholder in the company's empire. The company's dividend and the nation's budget had been wired together. And within 5 years, that beautiful machine produced 2 catastrophes, one in Bengal, one in the ledgers of London. They are the same story, and the first one demands to be told with care. In 1769, the monsoon failed over Bengal. The rains failed, the rice crop failed, and through 1770 the province starved. The scale is genuinely uncertain, and honesty requires saying so. The company's own incoming governor, Warren Hastings, reported in 1772 an estimate that 1/3 of the population had perished, a figure most modern historians consider far too high. Serious modern estimates range from around 1 million deaths to several million. No one will ever know, because nobody in authority was counting. What the record does establish, coldly and clearly, is what the company did with its tax machine while its taxpayers died. The land revenue was not suspended. It was enforced, and by the company's own revenue accounts, collections for 1771 came in higher than they had been before the rains failed. Company servants were widely accused, then and since, of profiteering in grain as prices soared. The company had not caused the drought, but it had spent 5 years stripping the surplus out of Bengal, the stores, the reserves, the cushion a society keeps against a bad year. And when the bad year came, the revenue engine kept running. A government answers, eventually, for its famines. A corporation answers to its shareholders, and the shareholders were owed 12.5%. Now watch that dividend, because it is about to detonate in London. The truth was that the company's Bengal windfall had been oversold from the start. The costs of its army were devouring the revenue. The famine had gutted collections going forward, even as the 1771 arrears were squeezed in, and the 12.5% dividend was increasingly being paid not out of profit, but out of borrowing, a corporation maintaining its share price with debt while its underlying business bled. The stock had already lurched downward once in 1769, when news reached London that the company was at war again in southern India, and into that overstretched, over-leveraged, overconfident market walked a speculator. If you have watched this channel's story of the Industrial Revolution, you have met him. Alexander Fordyce, the London banker who gambled his bank's money against East India stock, lost and fled to France in June 1772, toppling his own bank, then the Ayr Bank of Scotland, then a swathe of smaller houses in the Great Credit Panic of 1772. We told that story from the side of the banks, and we said then that the panic reached the mighty East India Company, which had to be rescued by the government, a story we would tell elsewhere. This is that story, because from the company's side, the panic was not the disease. It was the tide going out, and it revealed that the corporation which owned Bengal could not pay its bills. In the summer of 1772, with credit frozen across Britain, the company faced customs duties it could not pay, loans from the Bank of England it could not roll over, and warehouses full of tea it could not sell. In August, the conqueror of Bengal went to the British government as a beggar. It asked for a loan on a scale no private business had ever requested from a state. And here is the turn that makes this the ancestor of every financial crisis you have lived through. Parliament could have let it fail. There were members who wanted exactly that, who called the company corrupt, overmighty, and deserving of ruin. But then someone did the arithmetic of failure, and the arithmetic was terrifying. The company owed money across the whole city of London. Its collapse would fall on a banking system already on its knees. The Treasury's $400,000 a year and the great flow of customs duty on company tea were built into the national budget. And behind everything stood the unthinkable strategic question: if the company fell, who exactly would be governing Bengal? The state had allowed a private company to become the load-bearing wall of both the public finances and the empire. It could not be allowed to collapse because everything was leaning on it. So, in 1773, Parliament lent the East India Company £1.4 million of public money. It was the first great state rescue of a private corporation, the original bailout. And every argument made in 2008 about banks was made in 1773 about the company, in almost the same words: outrage that reckless men were being saved from their own greed, and the weary answer that the alternative was worse. But Parliament had learned the other half of the lesson too, the half we are still relearning. If the public bears the risk, the public demands control. The price of the money was the Regulating Act of 1773, the first time the British state reached inside the company and rearranged it. A Governor-General for Bengal, Warren Hastings, with a council watching him. A Crown Court in Calcutta, the dividend capped while the loan was outstanding. Reforms to the company's own elections. Every modern bailout condition, the oversight board, the pay restraint, the statesman inside the boardroom, is a descendant of that act. Privatized profit had met socialized loss, and the state had discovered that saving a company entitles you to run it. And then there was the tea, £17 million weight of it, sitting unsold in the company's London warehouses, a mountain of stock at the heart of its cash crisis. Parliament's solution was the Tea Act of 1773. Let the company ship tea directly to the American colonies, cutting out the middlemen so cheap that it would undercut even the smugglers who supplied much of America's tea. From London, it looked like an elegant piece of corporate rescue. From Boston, it looked like something else entirely, a state-backed monopoly being dumped on the colonies, carrying with it the one tax Parliament had pointedly kept, a tax the colonists had never consented to. If the company's cheap tea were swallowed, the principle came with it. On the 16th of December 1773, Bostonians boarded the company's ships and threw 342 chests of its tea into the harbour. The company, being the company, valued the loss precisely, £9,659. Parliament answered with punishment, the colonies answered with congresses, and within 2.5 years the quarrel was a revolution. Follow the causal chain backwards, because it is one of the most remarkable in modern history. The American Revolution's spark was a tea shipment. The tea shipment was a bailout measure. The bailout was needed because a corporation with an army had gambled itself to the edge of ruin on the far side of the world. The rescue of the world's biggest company helped cost Britain America. You might think that would be the end of the experiment. Instead, the next 80 years became something slower and stranger. The state swallowing the company one bite at a time, nationalization by installments. The reckoning began with the men. Clive was hauled before a parliamentary inquiry into Bengal, where, confronted with the fortune he had taken after Plassey, he protested that, considering the treasure that had lain open to him, he stood astonished at his own moderation. Parliament, remarkably, voted that he had rendered great services to his country. It did not save him. In November 1774, he died suddenly at his London house, by his own hand, according to most contemporaries. The record is not conclusive. A man who had won a province and never won an argument about how. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General, was impeached in 1788 in Westminster Hall, with Edmund Burke leading the prosecution in one of the great political spectacles of the century. The trial dragged on for 7 years and ended in acquittal, but the trial itself was the point. For 7 years, the British state publicly examined what a corporation had done with sovereign power. It was, in everything but name, the first great corporate accountability hearing. The thinkers arrived at the same verdict from opposite directions. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, dissected the company as an absurdity of design. A monopoly trading company was bad at governing, and a governing body was bad at trade, and an entity attempting both would do each corruptly. Burke put it in a single phrase that has never been bettered. The company, he said, was a state in the disguise of a merchant, and Parliament kept acting on that verdict. Pitt's India Act of 1784 created a government board of control sitting above the company's directors. From now on, the merchant proposed, but the state disposed. And yet, here is the paradox of the whole era. Even as London tightened the leash, the animal kept growing. Under governors-general answerable to that board, the company's wars rolled across India, and its sepoy army swelled to the roughly 260,000 men of 1803, where this story began, a private force about twice the size of the British Army, conquering in the name of shareholders who never left London. Then the state took the next bite. In 1813, Parliament stripped the company of its monopoly on trade with India. In 1833, it went further and ended the company's commercial business altogether. No more trade at all, not so much as a chest of tea. Sit with the strangeness of that. The East India Company from 1833 was a company that sold nothing. It existed to govern India on the Crown's behalf, while its shareholders were paid a guaranteed dividend of 10.5%, a fixed return charged on the taxes of India for owning shares in a government. The disguise Burke described had been formalized. The merchant was gone. Only the state in costume remained. It took one more catastrophe to strip the costume off. In 1857, the company's own Bengal army rose against it. The spark was the new Enfield rifles' greased cartridges, which soldiers believed, with cause, offended both Hindu and Muslim religious law. The deeper fuel was decades of annexation, as the company swallowed Indian states under legal doctrines of its own devising, including the Great Kingdom of Awadh the year before. The rising began at Meerut in May 1857 and became a year of war across northern India, with terrible violence and terrible reprisals on both sides. A human catastrophe this channel will not reduce to spectacle. What matters for this story is the verdict London drew from it. The experiment was over. A corporation could no longer be trusted with the government of a fifth of humanity, not least because the corporation had needed the British state's army to survive its own. In 1858, the Government of India Act transferred everything, the territories, the treaties, the armies, the debts, from the company to the Crown. Queen Victoria's proclamation that November announced the change to India directly. The company that had been chartered to buy pepper had ended as the delivery mechanism by which Britain acquired an empire, and the state, having absorbed the asset, wound up the shell with an accountant's tidiness. The shareholders kept their guaranteed dividend until 1874, when the stock was finally redeemed and the East India Company was dissolved, not on a battlefield, but in a redemption schedule. Even the ending carried the company's signature. The cost of paying off its shareholders was charged to the revenues of India. The country paid to buy out the corporation that had owned it. So count what this one company left behind, because you are living in all of it. The permanent joint stock corporation, the immortal business, is the company's invention, and it is the legal form of essentially every large enterprise on Earth. The stock market grew up pricing its shares. The first great share manias and crashes ran through its stock. The agency problem, managers enriching themselves at the expense of owners and everyone else, was diagnosed on the company's servants before the phrase existed. The regulatory state was built piece by piece as a cage for it. The inquiry, the oversight board, the accountability trial, each one improvised in response to something the company had just done. And above all, 1772 established the precedent that has governed every systemic crisis since. Let an enterprise grow until the public finances lean on it, and it acquires a claim on the public purse that no free market principle can dislodge. Profits private, losses public, oversight afterwards. The whole modern script was written in a single decade, with a tea party for a closing scene. Which is why the company's story refuses to stay in the 18th century. Every time a bank is rescued because its failure would bring down the system, every time a corporation's revenues rival a state's budget, and its decisions reach further than most governments, every time lawmakers summon executives to explain a power no one ever exactly voted to give them, we are rerunning the East India problem. What does a society do with a company that has outgrown the rules that made it? Britain's answer took 85 years, one lost continent, and a rebellion to complete, and it was the bluntest answer available. If a company becomes a state, the state takes it over. The machinery that replaced the company, the professional civil service, the accountable ministries, and behind everything a central bank learning, panic by panic, to stand behind the system, is machinery whose construction we have been tracing elsewhere on this channel, from the founding bargain of the Bank of England to the money machine that financed the factories. The East India Company is the dark twin of that story, proof of what the same instruments, joint stock, cheap credit, state charters, could build when they were pointed not at mills and canals, but at the revenues of a conquered province. The tools do not choose, the people holding them do. Sources for this account include the East India Company's founding charter of 1600 and its successor charters, the Parliamentary Select Committee reports on Bengal of the early